If you've ever poured your entire professional life into one place, only to be shown the door with a cold smile and a handful of corporate buzzwords, then you and I have something in common. Let me know what you think of my story in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an update. My name is Colin. For 20 years, I was the Senior Vice President of Human Resources at Sterling Cross. That's a fancy title for a guy who was, for all intents and purposes, the company's plumber. I didn't lay the golden pipes, but when they burst, when the filth threatened to flood the pristine marble floors of the executive wing, I was the one they called. I was the one who went into the dark, cramped spaces with a wrench and a strong stomach to fix the problems no one else wanted to admit existed. I did it quietly, I did it discreetly, and I did it with a loyalty that I mistook for a life insurance policy. Turns out, it was more like a prepaid funeral. The end came on a Tuesday. Tuesdays are always the worst days for bad news. Monday has the lingering haze of the weekend. Wednesday is the hump. Thursday holds the promise of Friday. But Tuesday is just a raw, exposed nerve of a day. I was summoned to the main conference room on the 40th floor, the one with the panoramic view of the city that was supposed to make you feel powerful, but on that day it just made me feel very, very small. Sitting at the head of the ridiculously long mahogany table was Brett. Brett was our new CEO, a private equity wunderkind barely in his 40s, with a jawline so sharp you could probably slice a bagel on it, and a vocabulary that consisted exclusively of words he'd learned in a TED Talk. He was all about synergy, disruption, and forward-facing paradigms. He looked at a company like Sterling Cross, with its 50-year history, and didn't see a legacy. He saw a dusty old house that needed to be gutted to the studs. I apparently was one of the load-bearing walls he was eager to knock down. He wasn't alone. Next to him was a woman from corporate counsel I'd never seen before, whose expression was so professionally blank, it was practically a screensaver. Brett started with the usual verbal gymnastics. He spoke of a strategic realignment and a new vision for talent acquisition. He said the company was pivoting to a more agile framework. He used the word modern 4 times in the first 2 minutes. I just sat there, my hands resting on the cool surface of the table, and listened to him describe the future of a company I had helped build, a future that very clearly did not include me. Then came the knife. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. The picture of compassionate authority. He said, "Colin, your contributions have been substantial, but we feel the HR leadership needs to be more aligned with modern hiring practices. We're moving in a new direction." Just like that. 20 years, 2 decades of my life, of navigating ugly lawsuits, of talking people off ledges, of convincing brilliant but difficult engineers to stay, of burying the kind of scandals that would have sunk lesser companies, all of it erased in a single condescending sentence, aligned with modern hiring practices. It was like telling a master carpenter his hand tools were obsolete because someone invented a 3D printer. He had no idea what I did. He saw a 58-year-old man, with a traditional title and an outdated salary, and decided I was dead weight. My severance package was standard. A few months' pay, a token extension of benefits. It was the corporate equivalent of a thanks for playing ribbon. The lawyer slid the folder across the table. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside. I'd written the template for that very package a decade ago. The irony was so thick I could taste it. It tasted like rust. As I stood up, my knees cracking softly in the silent room, Brett added one last thing, an afterthought that would change everything. He said, "Oh, and Colin, that old filing cabinet in your office, the big gray one, my head of IT tells me it's not on the network, probably just full of ancient payroll stubs or something. Just leave it. We'll have facilities dispose of it." I felt a sudden icy calm spread through my chest, the kind of calm that comes just before the storm. I looked at him, at his perfectly coiffed hair and his smug, confident smile. He had no idea. He was a child playing with matches in a dynamite factory, and he had just handed me the fuse. That cabinet wasn't full of payroll stubs. It was labeled Executive Transition Files, a deliberately boring name I'd come up with 15 years ago with the old CEO, Arthur Sterling, the founder's son. Arthur understood that business, at its core, is human, and humans are messy. The cabinet was our solution to that mess. It contained every confidential settlement, every hushed-up HR complaint, every negotiated early retirement package for the last 2 decades. It was the company's confessional, its secret history, and I was its keeper. Brett thought it was a relic. He didn't know it was an arsenal. I just nodded. Of course, Brett. I'll leave it. The walk back to my office was the longest walk of my life. People I'd hired, people whose kids' graduation parties I'd attended, looked away as I passed. The news was already spreading. In the digital age, corporate executions are live streamed through whispers and worried glances. I got to my office, and a young security guard I didn't recognize was standing by the door. He was holding a cardboard box. "For your personal effects, sir." I didn't have many. A picture of my wife Sarah and me on our 25th anniversary, a framed schematic of a sailboat I was building in my garage, a project that had become my own form of therapy, a heavy, ugly-looking paperweight, shaped like a ship's anchor, a gift from a team I'd saved from being outsourced years ago. I packed them slowly, methodically. The guard watched me, his expression a mixture of pity and discomfort. When I was done, I stood for a moment and looked at the gray, 4-drawer filing cabinet in the corner. It was old, scratched, and utterly unremarkable. It hummed with a silent potential energy that only I could feel. Brett thought he was disposing of junk. In reality, he was throwing away the company's unwritten constitution, the very document that explained why all the other shinier parts of his new kingdom were still standing. Competence isn't cheap until you lose it, and he was about to learn that lesson the hard way. I took one last look around the office that had been my second home for half my life. Then I picked up my box and walked out, leaving the security guard to lock the door behind me. I didn't look back. As I rode the elevator down for the final time, I reached into my pocket and felt the familiar cool metal of my keys, my house key, my car key, and one other, a small, simple, standard-issue key for a filing cabinet lock. It was on the ring with all the others, sitting on my desk at home, and the investigative journalist I was having lunch with tomorrow, a sharp, tenacious woman named Maria Vance, was very, very interested in the history of executive transitions at Sterling Cross. Brett wanted to be aligned with modern practices. I was about to give him a history lesson he'd never forget. The drive home was a blur. The city lights smeared across the windshield like wet paint. I parked in the driveway, but I didn't get out of the car. I just sat there in the dark, the engine ticking as it cooled, the silence of the garage pressing in on me. The professional composure I'd maintained in that conference room, the mask I'd worn for 20 years, finally began to crack. It wasn't a flood of tears. It was a slow, crushing pressure in my chest, a hollowness that seemed to echo with Brett's words, aligned with modern hiring practices, new direction. It was corporate speak for you're old and in the way. My hands were trembling slightly on the steering wheel. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I saw the lines around my eyes, the flecks of gray at my temples. I saw a man who had given everything to a company that had just told him he was worthless. For 2 decades I had been the loyal soldier. I had defended the castle, patched the walls and buried the bodies, all in the name of the crown. And for my service, I'd been thanked with exile. The anger came then, but it wasn't hot and explosive. It was cold and heavy, like a block of ice forming in my gut. I finally went inside. The house was quiet. My wife Eleanor was at her weekly book club meeting. I was grateful for the solitude. I didn't want to see the pity in her eyes. Not yet. I walked into my study, the one room in the house that was truly mine. It was lined with bookshelves, filled not with business theory, but with history and biographies. On the wall was a framed map of the world from the 18th century. It was a reminder that borders shift, empires fall, and the names of kings are eventually forgotten. I dropped my keys on the large oak desk. They made a sharp metallic clatter in the stillness. There it was, the small unassuming key to the gray filing cabinet. It looked so insignificant, so ordinary, but it was the key to Pandora's box. I picked it up, its cold weight familiar in my palm. My mind started to drift back, not just over the last few hours, but over the last 20 years. The memories came in waves, sharp and vivid. I remembered my first meeting with Arthur Sterling, the old CEO. He'd hired me away from a rival firm. He was a man of quiet integrity, old money, and an almost paternalistic sense of responsibility for his employees. He'd looked at me across his vast mahogany desk and said, "Colin, I don't need an HR man who just ticks boxes. I need a partner. I need someone who understands that this company is a family, a dysfunctional one at times, but a family, nonetheless. Your job is to keep us together, even when we're at our worst." It was Arthur who had commissioned the cabinet. It was after a particularly nasty incident involving a senior vice president of sales, a man named Henderson, and a young marketing associate. It was a clear-cut case of harassment, but Henderson was the top rainmaker, responsible for nearly 30% of the company's revenue. Firing him would have been catastrophic for the stock price, so we handled it. I handled it. We paid the young woman a settlement, so large she could buy a small island. She signed an NDA thicker than a phone book, and Henderson was quietly reassigned to a new strategic role in Europe for a year before taking an early retirement. His departure was announced in a glowing memo, praising his contributions. I remember sitting with Arthur after it was all done. He looked tired. He said, "We can't let things like this see the light of day, Colin. Not because we're evil, but because the world is black and white, and business is gray. The wolves on Wall Street would tear us apart. We need a place to keep the gray, a place to document it, to learn from it, but to keep it safe." So the executive transition files were born. I became the keeper of the gray. Over the years that cabinet filled up. There was the file on the CFO who had a gambling problem and was cooking the books on his expense reports. We didn't fire him. We got him into rehab, paid his debts confidentially, and restructured his role to have less direct access to discretionary funds. He stayed for another 10 years and was one of our most effective financial minds. There was the file on the brilliant but alcoholic head of R&D. We staged an intervention, sponsored his recovery, and he went on to develop the patent that became the company's cash cow for a decade. These weren't just skeletons. They were stories of redemption, of problems solved with nuance and compassion instead of a guillotine. But not all of them were so noble. There were darker files, the hushed-up allegations against Marcus Thorne, a current and very powerful board member, from his time as head of the international division. Allegations that were settled quietly, with a check and a non-disclosure agreement, before they could become a public spectacle. There was the documentation of how the previous board had forced out one of the company's co-founders, using a manufactured performance review to trigger a clause in his contract. I had been the one to draft that review, following orders, a knot of acid in my stomach the entire time. Each file was a ghost, a memory of a battle fought in the shadows, and I had been the general of that secret army. I had rationalized it all under the banner of protecting the company. I told myself I was doing the right thing, the hard thing, for the greater good. I was a company man. It was a source of pride. Now sitting in my study, that pride felt like a fool's delusion. The company I had protected no longer existed. It had been conquered by a barbarian like Brett, who saw my loyalty, not as a virtue, but as a vulnerability. My phone buzzed on the desk, a text from Sarah Jenkins.
Sarah was a sharp, empathetic HR manager I had hired straight out of college 8 years ago. I'd mentored her, taught her everything I knew about the gray areas of the job. The text read, "Colin, I just heard. I am so sorry. What they did is disgusting. Are you okay?" Her message was a small crack of light in the darkness. It was proof that not everything I had built had turned to dust. I had built relationships. I had invested in people, and people, unlike stock prices or strategic paradigms, had memories. I typed back a simple reply. "I'm fine, Sarah. Thank you for reaching out. It means a lot." I leaned back in my chair, the leather groaning in protest. I looked at the little key still in my hand. For 20 years I had used my knowledge to protect the company from itself. My loyalty had been to the institution, to Arthur Sterling's vision of it. But that institution was gone. Brett hadn't just fired me. He had released me. He had severed the chains of loyalty that had bound me for so long. My duty was no longer to the crown. It was to the history that the crown had tried to discard. Eleanor came home about an hour later. She found me in the study, staring at the old map. She didn't say anything at first. She just came up behind me and put her hands on my shoulders. She had a way of knowing when things were wrong, a sixth sense honed over 30 years of marriage. "They let you go," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my throat tight. Brett said I wasn't aligned with modern hiring practices. Eleanor's hands tightened on my shoulders. I expected sympathy. What I got was a slow burning fury. Modern practices. That little boy in a suit who thinks a company runs on buzzwords and an algorithm. For 20 years, you protected them, Colin. You cleaned up their messes. You sacrificed evenings and weekends and God knows how much of your own peace of mind to keep that place stable. What did that loyalty get you? A cardboard box and an escort to the door. Her anger was a catalyst. It was the spark that lit the cold, heavy fuel in my gut. She was right. I had been the dutiful steward of secrets for a kingdom that no longer valued them. I had been a company man for a company that was now just a brand, a shell corporation, run by a man who wouldn't know institutional knowledge if it bit him on his perfectly chiseled jaw. "He doesn't know about the cabinet," I said, my voice low. Eleanor knew about the cabinet, not the specifics, but she knew of its existence. She called it my box of ghosts. "He thinks it's full of old payroll documents," I continued. "He told me to just leave it for disposal." A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face. It was a smile I hadn't seen in years. It was the smile of the fierce, take-no-prisoners woman I had fallen in love with 3 decades ago. "Well then," she said softly, "it sounds to me like it's time for a little history lesson." That was it. That was the moment the ice in my gut hardened into steel. The resignation, the shock, the sense of betrayal, it all coalesced into a single sharp point of crystalline resolve. I wasn't a victim. I was a historian, and my subject was about to become very public. I picked up my phone again. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name Maria Vance. She was a journalist, a real one. The kind who wrote long, deeply researched articles that could unravel a company's carefully crafted public image with a few well-placed facts. We'd spoken once, a few years back, for a story she was doing on executive compensation. I'd been professionally evasive, but she'd been sharp and fair. I had a feeling she'd be interested in this story. I pressed the call button. She answered on the second ring. "Vance, Maria, it's Colin McGregor from Sterling Cross. We spoke a couple of years ago." There was a brief pause. "I remember you, Colin, the man who could say no comments in 15 different ways. To what do I owe the pleasure? Don't tell me you're finally ready to dish on executive bonuses." "Something like that," I said, my voice steady. "Something much more interesting." some free time on my hands. I was wondering if you might be available for lunch tomorrow. I want to talk to you about the history of executive transitions at my former company. I think you'll find it illuminating. I could almost hear her smile through the phone. Colin, she said, her voice now brimming with professional curiosity. I am suddenly very hungry. We set a time and place, a quiet Italian restaurant downtown, neutral territory. As I hung up, I looked at the key on my desk. It was no longer a symbol of my past servitude. It was the instrument of my future. Brett wanted a modern company. I was about to introduce his brave new world to the ghosts of the old one. And ghosts, as I knew better than anyone, have a way of getting their due.
The next morning, I didn't wake up with a sense of dread. I woke up with a purpose. It was a feeling I hadn't realized was missing until it returned. For years, my purpose had been defensive, to protect, to contain, to manage. Now it was offensive. It was to build a narrative, to lay a foundation for the truth. This wasn't about petty revenge. This was about correcting the record. It was about proving that the things Brett couldn't measure on a spreadsheet, loyalty, history, institutional knowledge, were the most valuable assets a company had, and he had just thrown them in the trash. My plan wasn't to just dump a box of files on a journalist's lap. That was amateurish. It was messy. It could be spun as the work of a disgruntled employee. No, my approach had to be like everything else I'd done for 20 years, meticulous, strategic, and utterly deniable until the moment of impact. I wasn't a whistleblower. I was a historian offering a guided tour. First, I needed to understand the true nature of my leverage. The executive transition files were not just a collection of dirty secrets. They were a comprehensive chronological record of the company's soul-saving compromises. Arthur Sterling had been a stickler for process. Every file followed a strict protocol. It started with the initial complaint or issue, documented in detail. It was followed by my handwritten notes from interviews, legal's risk assessment, and then the crucial part, the resolution memo. This was a document, co-signed by me and Arthur and later his successor before Brett, that outlined the rationale for our course of action. It explained why we chose a quiet settlement over a public firing, or why we invested in an employee's recovery instead of cutting them loose. It was a philosophical document, as much as a legal one. It was the codification of the gray. I spent the morning not in my workshop but at my desk with a fresh legal pad and a pen. I wasn't just recalling the files, I was categorizing them. I drew a map of the company's hidden power structure, connecting names and events. There was Marcus Thorne, the board member with the hushed-up harassment problem in the London office. He was Brett's biggest champion on the board, the one who had pushed for his appointment as CEO. Then there was Cynthia Gates, the current head of marketing, a brilliant strategist who had a DUI incident early in her career that we'd made disappear. Her loyalty was to the old guard, to the company that had given her a second chance. She despised Brett's data-driven, soulless approach to marketing. And then there was the big one, the keystone, a file I hadn't thought about in years. It concerned a failed international expansion into South America about a decade ago. The project had been a disaster, losing the company nearly $50 million. The executive in charge, a man named David Miller, had been publicly fired for incompetence. But the file told a different story. The file contained engineering reports that Miller had commissioned, which clearly stated the project was unfeasible due to local infrastructure issues. It also contained memos from the then COO, a man who was now a celebrated titan of industry on several other corporate boards, ordering Miller to proceed anyway, to make the numbers work for the quarterly report. We had buried the reports, paid Miller a handsome severance to sign an NDA, and made him the scapegoat to protect the COO. and the stock price. That former COO was the lead investor in the private equity firm that had just installed Brett as CEO. His entire reputation was built on the lie that David Miller's file kept safe. This wasn't just dirt. This was leverage of a geological scale. Releasing this one file wouldn't just embarrass Brett. It would destabilize the very foundation of his support. It would be a shot across the bow, not just at Sterling Cross, but at the entire old boys network that had put him in power. My phone buzzed. It was Sarah again. They're asking for the old personnel archives. The digital ones only go back 7 years. Trent, your replacement, is furious. He says it's unacceptable data hygiene. Trent. I remembered his type. Young, arrogant, armed with a fresh MBA and the belief that any problem could be solved with a new piece of software. He wouldn't understand that the real archives weren't on a server. They were in people's heads, and in some very specific cases, in a locked gray cabinet. I replied, tell him to check the off-site storage manifests from before the 2015 digital migration. That should keep him busy for a week. Let me know what he does. I was laying breadcrumbs, but not for Brett or Trent. They were for Sarah. I needed her to see the contrast between my methodical approach and their frantic incompetence. I was cultivating my most important asset, an ally on the inside. An ally I had spent 8 years training. With the map of secrets laid out, I focused on the journalist Maria Vance. I spent an hour reading her recent articles. Her style was incisive but fair. She didn't rely on anonymous sources alone. She built her stories on documents, on timelines, on the paper trail that companies always foolishly believed they could erase. She built narratives of cause and effect. That was my opening. I wouldn't just give her facts, I would give her a story. The story of a company's cultural decay, personified by the journey of one filing cabinet. My preparation for the lunch meeting was as meticulous as if I were preparing for a major legal deposition. I didn't print out any of the explosive files. That was too risky. Instead, I prepared a 1-page prospectus. At the top, I wrote the title, The History of Executive Transitions at Sterling Cross 1998 to 2023. Below I listed 3 case studies, identified only by date and a vague description. Case Study A 2004, The Rainmaker's Quiet Exit. Topic, Executive Misconduct and Revenue Protection. Case Study B 2012, The Scapegoat of South America. Topic, Corporate Malfeasance and Reputational Shielding 3. Case Study C 2018, The Board Member's London Problem. Topic, International Compliance and Leadership Vetting. At the bottom of the page I wrote a single sentence, all supporting documentation is currently held in secure off-network storage location pending. It was a professional, almost academic presentation. It gave Maria the scent of blood without me having to wield the knife myself. It established me as a credible, organized source, not a man burning his life's work in a fit of pique. The final piece of my plan was the most audacious. It had come to me in the middle of the night. The cabinet itself. Brett thought it was junk. But now, after my carefully placed breadcrumbs, his incompetent replacement Trent would be hunting for old records. Eventually that hunt would lead them to the gray cabinet. Brett's dismissal of it would turn into suspicion, and I had to use that. I made one phone call to a man named George. George was the head of night shift security at Sterling Cross headquarters. I had hired him 15 years ago. He was a former cop, quiet, observant, and fiercely loyal. I had helped him out when his son got into some trouble. Not by breaking rules, but by connecting him with a good lawyer and arranging a flexible work schedule. It was one of the hundreds of small human acts that I had performed as part of my job, the kind of thing that never appears on a performance review. George, it's Colin McGregor. Mr. McGregor. I heard what happened. It's a damn shame. It is what it is, George. Listen,
I need a favor, a big one, and it needs to be completely off the books. I explained what I needed. I needed him to let me into my old office tonight. I needed him to stand watch for 10 minutes. I needed him to forget he ever saw me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. They have cameras everywhere now, Colin. Not in the service elevator shaft, they don't, I said, and not in the 38th floor electrical closet. The one with the faulty motion sensor I told maintenance to ignore 6 months ago because it kept tripping. Another pause, then a low chuckle. You always knew where the bodies were buried, didn't you, sir? Even the electrical ones. Service elevator D. 2 a.m. You'll have 15 minutes. The line went dead. My plan was now in motion. That night, Eleanor and I executed a different kind of operation. We went to our storage unit and retrieved 4 boxes of our old, meticulously organized tax records and financial statements from the 1990s. They were dusty, heavy, and utterly, profoundly boring. At 1:45 a.m., I was parked a block away from the Sterling Cross Tower, dressed in dark clothes, carrying 2 empty duffel bags. I felt like a character in a spy movie. I slipped into the alley, to the unmarked door of service elevator D. As promised, it was unlocked. The ride up to the 38th floor was silent and nerve-wracking. I slipped out, found the electrical closet, and took the service stairs up 2 flights. The executive wing was dark and silent, an alien landscape without the hum of human activity. George was nowhere to be seen, which was exactly as it should be. My old office door was unlocked. I slipped inside. There it was, the gray cabinet, standing like a tombstone in the dark. My heart was pounding. I took out the small key and opened the top drawer. The familiar scent of old paper and ink filled the air. I worked quickly, my hands sure and steady. I emptied the contents of all 4 drawers, the real files, the ghosts of 2 decades, into the duffel bags. Then I took out the boxes of my old tax records and filled the cabinet with them, folder after folder of tedious, worthless, ancient personal accounting. I slammed the drawers shut, locked the cabinet, and pocketed the key. 10 minutes later, I was back in the service elevator, the duffel bags heavy, with the real history of Sterling Cross. As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt a profound sense of transfer. The company's soul was no longer locked in a piece of office furniture. It was with me. It was now my story to tell. I drove home with the ghosts in my passenger seat, and for the first time since that awful meeting, I smiled. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for the right people to walk into it. The lunch with Maria Vance was at a place called Giovanni's, a classic, old-school Italian restaurant, with dark wood, white tablecloths, and waiters who moved with quiet efficiency. It was the kind of place where conversations could happen, unheard, in plain sight. I arrived exactly on time. Maria was already there, sitting in a corner booth, nursing a glass of sparkling water. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered a handshake, firm and professional. "Colin," she said with a slight, knowing smile, "you look like a man with a story to tell." "I'm a man with a great deal of respect for history, Maria," I replied, sliding into the booth. "I've recently come to believe some of it is in danger of being permanently erased." We ordered. I kept the small talk to a minimum. I knew she was a professional and appreciated directness. Once the waiter had departed, I slid the single-page prospectus I had prepared across the table. She picked it up, her eyes scanning the page, lingering on the 3 case study descriptions. I saw a flicker of intense interest, the professional hunter catching a scent. "This is quite a menu," she said, her voice low. The Rainmaker's quiet exit. The scapegoat of South America. The board member's London problem. These sound less like executive transitions and more like chapters in a thriller. Sometimes they were one and the same, I said. For 20 years, my job was to ensure the thriller never got published. My former employer, under its new leadership, seems to believe that history is irrelevant. They believe you can build a future without understanding the foundation it's built upon. I didn't give her names. I didn't give her details. I spoke in abstracts, about philosophies of management. I told her about Arthur Sterling's belief in the gray, in handling human problems with discretion and strength. I contrasted that with Brett's philosophy, a world of black and white data points, where legacy and loyalty were liabilities. I was framing the narrative, giving her the context, before I gave her the proof. And all the documentation for these case studies, she asked, tapping the bottom line of the page. It's in this secure off-network storage. It is. I confirmed. It was, until 2 days ago, housed in a 4-drawer filing cabinet in my office. A cabinet my former CEO dismissed as ancient payroll stubs and ordered to be disposed of. Her eyes lit up. This was the hook, the detail that transformed the story from a simple case of a disgruntled employee into something more. It was about arrogance. It was about incompetence. So the new CEO has no idea what he's throwing away. He has no idea about anything, I said flatly. He sees a 50-year-old company as a fixer-upper. He can flip for a profit. He doesn't understand that a company is a living organism with a memory and a history. He's performing surgery with a chainsaw. We talked for 2 hours. I answered her questions carefully. I gave her just enough to confirm the potential, to let her see the shape of the iceberg without revealing its full destructive mess. I explained that I wasn't looking for a quick hit piece. I wanted the full story told, a deep dive into how corporate culture rots from the head down. As the lunch concluded, she leaned forward. Colin, I need something to start with, something I can use to start making calls, to get a reaction. I can't go to the company with just a story you've told me. I was prepared for this. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single sealed envelope. This isn't one of the case files, I said. It's something simpler. It's a copy of the original 1998 memo from Arthur Sterling to me, authorizing the creation of the Executive Transition Files Project. It outlines its purpose to handle sensitive personnel matters discreetly and internally, to protect the long-term stability and integrity of the Sterling Cross family. Pay close attention to the language he uses. Family, integrity, long-term stability. I pushed the envelope across the table. Ask Brett for a comment on that memo. Ask him if that philosophy of protecting the Sterling Cross family is still company policy. His answer, whatever it is, will be the start of your story. She took the envelope, a glint of triumph in her eyes. Colin, she said, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. The first tremor started 48 hours later. I got a frantic text from Sarah. All hell is breaking loose. A reporter called the PR department, asking about some old family's policy. Brett is livid. He's demanding to know who's talking to the press. I told her to keep her head down and just observe. The next move on the board was Brett's, and I knew he would be predictable, arrogant. Cornered men always are. The next text came an hour later. Trent is on a rampage. He's convinced the leak came from old HR files. He's tearing the department apart looking for physical records. Now he's asking about your old office. And then, the text I had been waiting for. Oh my God. He's talking about the gray cabinet. He's telling Brett it might be what the reporter is looking for. They're going down to your office now, with security. I pictured the scene. Brett, his jaw tight with anger. Trent, the sycophantic replacement, eager to prove his worth. They would go to my old office. They would see the cabinet. And Brett's casual dismissal of it would curdle into paranoid suspicion. He would remember me, the quiet, composed man he had fired, and a seed of doubt would be planted. What if the old man wasn't just dead weight? What if he was something else entirely? I sat in my study, a cup of coffee in my hand, and waited. The next text from Sarah was a picture, a blurry photo of two of the building's maintenance guys standing next to my old filing cabinet with a large industrial drill. The caption read, "They can't find a key. They're going to drill the lock." This was the moment of truth. My gamble. I had swapped the files. I had replaced a library of corporate dynamite with a collection of my boring personal tax records. If they got that cabinet open, they wouldn't find a smoking gun. They would find my 1996 mortgage application and receipts for a decade-old car repair. Brett, in his rage and paranoia, was about to publicly and destructively prove that he was a fool. The final text from Sarah for the day came late in the afternoon. "Cabinet is open. It's full of your old bank statements and tax forms. Everyone is just standing here staring at them. Trent looks like he's going to be sick." Brett stormed out without saying a word. I've never seen him look so angry and confused. I leaned back in my chair and took a long, slow sip of my coffee. I had made no overt move. I had threatened no one. I had simply allowed my opponent's own arrogance to be his undoing. He had gone to war, fired the big cannons, and blown a hole in his own ship. The silent takeover was underway. Maria Vance now had her story. A powerful new CEO, so paranoid about leaks that he had his security team drill into a filing cabinet full of his fired predecessor's junk mail. It was a story of incompetence, of a leader completely disconnected from the reality of his own company. And the best part, the real files, the real dynamite, were still safe in my possession, waiting for the perfect moment to be deployed. The first move was complete. The board was in check, and the king had no idea the game was already lost.
The fallout from what the staff started calling Cabinetgate was immediate and delicious. It wasn't a public explosion, it was a slow creeping rot from within the company walls. Sarah became my narrator, my eyes and ears providing a running commentary on the unfolding chaos. Brett's paranoia, having been publicly triggered and then spectacularly humiliated, didn't subside. It metastasized. He saw ghosts in every corner. He trusted no one. According to Sarah's texts, meetings became inquisitions. He and Trent launched a full-scale data security audit, which was just a flimsy pretext to interrogate long-serving employees, people I had hired and trusted for years. They were looking for the source of the leak to Maria Vance, but their ham-fisted approach only bred resentment and fear. They were treating the institutional memory of the company like a hostile insurgency. The very people who held the unwritten knowledge of how things actually worked were now being treated like suspects. This was when the first cracks in the dam began to show. It started with Cynthia Gates, the head of marketing. She was a brilliant, no-nonsense woman I'd personally championed for promotion over a decade ago, the one with the youthful DUI we'd helped her navigate. Her loyalty was to the company's integrity, not to its temporary management. Sarah told me Cynthia had a screaming match with Brett in his office. He had accused her department of being loose with information. She had fired back that her department was busy trying to salvage the company's reputation while he was busy playing secret agent with office furniture. 2 days later, Cynthia resigned. She didn't have another job lined up. She just walked away. Her departure sent a shockwave through the company. She was a pillar, a respected leader. It was the first real, tangible sign that the brain drain was beginning. This wasn't just losing an employee, it was losing a 20-year veteran, a repository of market knowledge and client relationships that couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. I heard a familiar phrase in my head: competence isn't cheap until you lose it. And then the exodus began in earnest. It wasn't a flood, but a steady, persistent stream. A senior engineer in R&D, the man who held the key patents for their flagship product, the same man whose recovery I had personally sponsored years ago. A logistics chief from the Midwest plant who knew the supply chain so intimately he could predict shipping delays based on the weather in another hemisphere. One by one, the quiet, essential cogs in the machine started to quit. They didn't make a scene. They just sent their polite, 2-week notices and disappeared. They were coming to me. My phone started ringing off the hook, not with job offers, but with calls for advice. Cynthia called me the day after she quit. "Colin, what the hell is going on over there? Brett's lost his mind. I can't work for a man who thinks loyalty is a liability." We talked for an hour. By the end of the call, I had offered her a consulting contract. I was starting my own firm, I told her. A small, agile consultancy focused on what Sterling Cross had just discarded: corporate culture, crisis management, and talent retention. Her first project, helping me draft a business plan. The calls kept coming. The engineer from R&D, the logistics chief. They weren't just looking for new jobs. They were looking for a flag to rally to. They were looking for a leader they trusted. I was becoming by default the government in exile. This was the moment Brett made his most desperate and most predictable move. He called me. It was a week after Cynthia's resignation. I was in my workshop, sanding a piece of mahogany for the sailboat, the scent of sawdust thick in the air. My phone buzzed on the workbench, displaying a name I never thought I'd see again. "Brett." I let it ring twice, then answered, putting it on speaker. "Hello, Brett." My voice was calm even. "Colin." He sounded strained, the usual arrogant swagger, replaced by a thin veneer of forced cordiality. "We need to talk." I thought we said everything that needed to be said. "Look," he said, and I could hear the frustration cracking through. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication. I may have been hasty in my decision-making." I continued sanding, the rhythmic rasp of the sandpaper against the wood, a counterpoint to his tense voice. "Hasty, that's one word for it. The board and I have been re-evaluating." He lied. I knew the board wasn't re-evaluating. They were panicking. Maria Vance had started making more targeted calls, asking about a failed South American venture. The ghosts were getting restless. "We'd like to offer you a new role, a senior advisory position. You'd report directly to me. Name your price. We want to show our legacy employees that they are valued." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. He was trying to buy back the very institutional knowledge he had thrown in the garbage a few weeks earlier. He didn't want me. He wanted to silence me. He wanted to put the ghosts back in the box. "An advisory role. That's a generous offer, Brett, but I'm afraid I'm not interested," I said calmly. There was a pause. Then his tone shifted. The pleading vanished, replaced by the snarl of a cornered animal. "All right, Colin. Let's cut the crap. I know you're talking to people. Cynthia Gates, Mark Renshaw. You're poaching my staff. That's a violation of your separation agreement. I'll sue you into the ground." This was the moment I had prepared for. "Brett," I said, stopping my sanding. The workshop fell silent. "I suggest you read that separation agreement again, specifically. Paragraph 11, subsection B, the non-solicitation clause. I drafted it myself back in 2009. It prevents a former employee from actively soliciting current employees for a period of 12 months. I haven't made a single outbound call to any of your staff. They, on the other hand, are free to call whomever they please. And as for theft of company property," I added, twisting the knife just a little, I trust you've completed your audit of my old filing cabinet. Did you find all of my 1990s tax documents to be in order? The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. He was checkmated. He had no legal standing, and he knew it. He had tried to use the corporate rulebook against the man who wrote it. "What do you want, Colin?" he finally whispered, his voice raw with defeat. I thought for a moment, looking at the half-finished hull of the sailboat, a project built on patience and precision. I don't want anything from you, Brett. You already gave me what I needed. You gave me my freedom. You reminded me that my value isn't tied to a title or a corner office. My value is in my experience, my relationships, and my good name. Things you can't buy, and things you clearly can't keep. I hung up the phone. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I felt a quiet, profound sense of rightness. The power hadn't just shifted, it had been reclaimed. Sterling Cross was a ship taking on water, captained by a madman, while the skilled crew was abandoning ship and getting into a lifeboat I had just finished building. The talent exodus was becoming a flood, and Brett was about to be swept away by a tide of his own making. The end came, as I knew it would, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a link in an email. Maria Vance's article was published a week after my call with Brett. It wasn't in some gossipy tabloid. It ran on the front page of the digital edition of a major financial journal. The headline was a work of art, a masterpiece of understated devastation. The Sterling Cross Method: How One Company Traded a Legacy of Stability for a Culture of Fear. Maria had woven the story perfectly. She started with the memo from Arthur Sterling, contrasting his philosophy of the Sterling Cross family with a dozen quotes from anonymous current and former employees, describing Brett's reign of terror. She detailed the exodus of key talent, naming Cynthia Gates and others who had agreed to go on the record about why they left. She painted a picture of a company in chaos, led by a CEO who was fundamentally incompetent at managing people. And then in the middle of the article, she deployed the story of Cabinetgate. She told it with journalistic precision, detailing how the new CEO, paranoid about leaks, had ordered a historic filing cabinet to be drilled open, only to find the innocuous personal records of the man he had just fired. It made Brett look not just foolish, but unhinged. It was the detail that made the entire story feel viscerally true to every person who has ever worked under a petty tyrant. But the masterstroke was what came next. The final third of the article pivoted. Maria, using information I had carefully guided her toward, began to ask questions about the company's past. She wrote, "While the new leadership at Sterling Cross seems obsessed with imaginary threats in the present, sources suggest there may be very real, unexamined issues in the company's past. Questions are now being raised about historical events, such as the company's costly and abrupt withdrawal from a South American venture in 2012, an event that ended the career of executive David Miller, who was made the public scapegoat." She didn't publish the documents. She didn't have to. She just pointed a giant, clag light at the darkest corner of the company's history and asked, "What's under that rug?" She mentioned the former COO by name, the man who was now Brett's patron saint in the private equity world. The article was a nuke. The company's stock dropped 12% by noon. The financial news channels were all over it. The narrative was set, a storied American company being run into the ground by a reckless, paranoid new CEO. The board of directors, the same board that had approved my termination, called an emergency meeting that afternoon. Marcus Thorne, Brett's champion with the London problem, was suddenly silent. The other board members, smelling blood in the water and facing a potential shareholder lawsuit over the stock plunge, were looking for a scapegoat of their own. A week later, I received an email from Sarah. She had finally submitted her own resignation that morning. Her email was short and sweet. Attached was a single PDF. It was a company-wide internal memo. The subject line, "Leadership Transition." The memo, written in the blandest corporate speak imaginable, announced that Brett had decided to step down to pursue other opportunities and that the board was grateful for his contributions. It was the corporate equivalent of being taken out to the back of the barn and shot. He was gone. His modern hiring practices had led to his own swift and brutal termination. Trent, his lackey, had been fired the same day. My vindication wasn't in that memo. It wasn't in seeing Brett fall. My vindication was in what happened next. The interim CEO they brought in was a man named Frank Gibbons, a semi-retired executive known for his steady hand. One of his first calls was to me. He didn't offer me my old job. We both knew that was impossible. Instead, he offered my new consulting firm, McGregor & Associates, a 6-month, 7-figure contract to assess and restore the corporate culture at Sterling Cross. He wanted me to interview the remaining staff, to identify the problems, and to help him rebuild what Brett had destroyed. I accepted. My first meeting with the Sterling Cross leadership team took place in the same 40th floor conference room where I had been fired. I sat at the head of the table, in the very chair Brett had occupied. I looked at the anxious faces around the table, the survivors of the storm. I didn't talk about synergy or paradigms. I talked about trust. I talked about respect. I talked about the importance of history. I told them that a company is not a machine, but a community, and that it had been badly broken. Our job, together, was to fix it. As I laid out my plan, I could feel the tension in the room begin to ease. For the first time in months, they weren't being managed. They were being led. I had been fired for being a relic of the past. Now I had been hired back to be the architect of their future, on my own terms. My new office was smaller than my old one, but it was mine. It looked out over the city, and for the first time, the view didn't make me feel small. It made me feel like I had finally found my proper place in the skyline. So here I am now, in my new office, building a new company, with the best people I ever worked with. The ones who valued competence over buzzwords, loyalty over ambition. People like Cynthia and Sarah. My consulting firm is thriving, because it turns out there are a lot of companies out there run by men like Brett, and a lot of good people who need help navigating the wreckage they leave behind. The duffel bags full of the executive transition files are in a secure bank vault. I haven't needed to use them again. Their power was never in their release. It was in their existence. It was in the knowledge that history, no matter how deeply you try to bury it, always has a way of coming back. The little key to that old gray cabinet sits on my desk now. It's a paperweight, a memento, a reminder. It reminds me that loyalty is a two-way street. It reminds me that true value isn't on a balance sheet. And it reminds me that sometimes the most powerful thing an old, outdated employee has is his memory. They thought they could erase 20 years of my life with a single meeting. They thought they could dispose of the past by simply throwing it in the trash. But they forgot the most important rule of all. Competence isn't cheap, but they learned just how expensive it is to lose it. The real assets of a company aren't its patents or its properties. It's the people who show up every day and quietly, diligently, keep the whole thing from falling apart. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt undervalued, overlooked, or cast aside by someone who couldn't see the value right in front of them, let me know in the comments below. I read them all, and I want to hear your stories. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about what happens when the quiet ones finally decide they've had enough. Sharing it with someone who needs to hear this message helps more than you know. Thank you for listening.